But here comes the final collapse of the mega-expensive US military program. It will go down in history as the grand scam of the century. Epic Littoral poppycock. And there are real miracles happening with hypersonics in the US. The Dark Eagle categorically does not fly, and the most promising missile program is on the verge of failure. But first things first. Here's a Littoral warship of the Independence type. Frankly speaking, the futility of this program is evident at the first glance at the very design of this trimaran. Although this ugly thing costs several times more than the world's most expensive billionaire's yacht or as much as a pair of fourth-generation multi-purpose nuclear submarines. And another one of my favorites from the many stories in the field of kickbacks of the American defense complex is the tale of two examples of the legendary, still remaining example of the legendary corruption of Boeing Sikorsky Ra-66 Comanche helicopters. These vehicles were built as part of the Light Helicopter Experimental Advanced Helicopter Program. In a nutshell, the story is that more money was spent on a promising reconnaissance attack helicopter with an intimidating shape, or rather only on its development, than on two nuclear-powered aircraft carriers with a full-fledged air wing. Each such helicopter, produced a total of 2 copies, cost the US military budget more than $4 billion. That is, more than 2 of the most expensive B-2 Spirit combat aircraft in world history. Eventually, after a lot of fumbling, the program was shut down in 2004 and tried to instantly forget about it. Everything was ordered in this story, and lobbying wars, clashes of interests between different lobbying groups, essentially legalized corruption. And a lot of cases of the most blatant corruption with natural lambasting of the right people, bribery of curators and technical experts. And amazing bloated estimates with 5 times the markup. The bonus was that the promised technical breakthrough that was supposed to come as a result of R&D, research and development, Comanche also turned out to be a bluff. This helicopter, a Boeing Sikorsky Ra-66 Comanche, is a terror flying on the wings of night. The truth is, it never flew. The helicopter ceased to be relevant a little before the first prototype was assembled. But even knowing this, Boeing's managers kept dragging their feet in order to warm their greedy hands on a concept that was obviously stillborn. Then they admitted that scientific and engineering research on the Comanche Ra-66, supposedly designed to improve the not-so-failed rotorcraft programs, turned out to be of no use to anyone at all. And the cherry on the cake was, of course, the final chord of this tragicomedy, when Boeing and Sikorsky in late 2004 simultaneously sued the US for depriving them of their fat order of 1,230 machines and received another $500 million in compensation. The Comanche scam was in its own way very remarkable, but far from the most grandiose in the 21st century. Apparently all American concepts with a 3-letter name like LHI, GSF, LCS and others were created with the sole purpose of being permanently sleep-deprived of all the world's most corrupt officials, so that they would wring their hands at night, wondering if it was possible? Just the day before it became known that the US Navy seems to have finally put an end to another such all-consuming money monster called Littoral Combat Ship, abbreviated LCS. The course of its development is very similar to the history of the Ra-66 Comanche, with the difference that here clever marketers and lobbyists of developers managed to sell a full-fledged serial production. This is the second type of ship, Littoral Combat Ship Freedom. They are so different, the one thing they have in common is that they both turned out to be completely worthless. The Littoral warship program, like the rest of the 3-letter designs, was built on a couple of fancy technical features whose hypertrophied development was supposed to slightly compensate for other design flaws and joints. The Comanche had incredible speed and stealth for a helicopter as leading advantages. The F-35 has low observability and net centricity, while these coastal ones are so eager to add troughs, modularity and extraordinary high mobility. Although, to call ships with displacement noticeably less than a small corvette of 2,800 tons and at the same time costing 3 times as much as the American standard cruiser Euro-type Ticonderoga, one should imagine a gold trough studded with a generous scattering of selected large diamonds. The firstborn of the series was laid down in the summer of 2005. And already at this stage it became clear that everything would be difficult and obscenely expensive. In good American tradition, during the course of the project, the price of one ship rose from $230 million to almost $1 billion, along with combat modules and maintenance. These little guys were expected to take on about a dozen or so functions: frigates, minesweepers, patrol boats, small landing craft, anti-submarines and others, and replace all the highly specialized ships with one all-purpose ship. And in the end, they were unable to fulfill any of these purposes. This is what the proverbial modularity was supposed to look like, but as they say, smooth was smooth on paper. According to the basic idea, both types of Littoral combat ship, which received the pathos names Freedom, Freedom and Independence, were to act as basic platforms for various modules of cannon, mine countermeasures, air defense, ASW, landing, helicopter and others. The developers assured that it is possible to completely change the ship's combat orientation in just 3 days, easily converting a frigate with guided missile weapons into a minesweeper, and a command ship with attack helicopters into a guided missile destroyer. I don't know what supercomputers Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics used to calculate this figure, but in practice it turned out that the complete replacement of modules, which turned out to be unusually brittle, took at least a month. This is what loading the cannon module for the Littoral combat ship looked like. Serving on the LSS has always been hard labor, for they could break down at any moment. A whole sea of new military specialties literally fell on the military sailors who had the misfortune to get into the crew, whose numbers were cut down due to fashionable whistles and rattles. In addition, the LSS never passed a single full-fledged survivability test, and this crucial point was simply overlooked. The possibility of their normal functioning in combat conditions remained a mystery behind Seven Seals. For the most part, they were idle in bases altogether, as literally every sea voyage was fraught with a massive breakdowns and minor and moderate accidents. As a result, the number of planned Littoral combat ships was first reduced from 60 to 32 pieces, and then limited to 18, 2 of which were never completed. And now it has finally decided to put them in the reserve, and under the CIP category, that is, they will be kept afloat for some time, without investing in modernization and hoping that someone will buy them. It's effectively a death sentence to a $37 billion program. Each such ship cost the US budget a total of more than $2 billion. None of them lasted more than 15 years. Now it is clear why the US is so insistent on teaching the whole world how to fight corruption. After all, practically everyone there knows about the shameful phenomenon to a fine point. Now, about hypersonic weapons. Real miracles are happening to him in the United States. The Dark Eagle absolutely refuses to fly, and the most promising missile program is on the verge of failure. This is how the playful imagination of computer artists at Lockheed Martin drew the mass-produced Dark Eagle missile cannons created as part of the long-range hypersonics weapon program. It's been 8 years, but the Eagle hasn't flown anywhere, and it's unclear if it ever will. About a year ago, a couple of American experts solemnly declared that the super-duper rocket, elevated to the rank of almost ready, still old Donald Trump, when he was President of the United States, finally made a successful full-cycle flight. And there are only a few months before the next child of the missile branch of Lockheed Martin, labeled AGM-183A, will enter service with the U.S. Air Force. It was to add to the huge arsenal of the legendary B-52, which is still not allowed to retire on a well-deserved retirement failed projects of later American heavy bombers and missile carriers. Then it turned out that despite optimistic forecasts, the rocket never really flew. A lot of people didn't want to believe it, but it was unthinkable that these high-tech USA, which had a 20-year head start in the development of such munitions and drew reference world speed records for itself back in the mid-noughties, would squander what seemed to come to them so in vain. EJM-183A was withdrawn from the hypersonic race back in March, literally sending the entire Western expert community back into shock, expecting anything but such an outcome. The US military had made arrogant claims just a year earlier that the country was developing dozens of hypersonic missile concepts of various basing and internal design. Now they have one single project left alive out of anything at all, under the Long-Range Hypersonics Weapon Program. It was supposed to be an intermediate-range missile of up to 2,800 kilometers whose maneuvering precision-guided warhead, the glider, would be capable of gaining speeds of up to Mach 17. It was originally to be armed with land forces, multi-purpose submarines, Virginia Block 5 and the long-suffering duck-billed destroyers of the Zamvold type. Then the Sturgeon was noticeably cut down and the technical specifications included a much more modest 5 to 6 Mahi and a distance of up to 1,650 kilometers. But that didn't work out either. What our dear former partners did not do to prove the validity of their participation in the hypersonic race. And passed off intermediate and firing tests as full-fledged rocket flights. And unleashed a dirty campaign against Russian hypersonic weapons in the process. And they even adopted a land-based version of the LRHW, informally named the Dark Eagle, before any of them had even made a single successful flight. By the way, here's this simply incredible photo from an exercise with yet another idiotic name, Thunderbolt Strike, March 2023. What is happening in the photo is just a simulation of a rocket launch, which does not physically exist in finished form, only in the image of prototypes, which for some reason never fly anywhere. Cargo cult of some kind. But let's move on. In September 2021, the Pentagon revealed to the world a bunch of videos of ready-made units allegedly with missiles arriving at the troops, being placed in specified position areas and seemingly entering experimental combat duty. That said, to reiterate again, the Dark Eagle never flew in full form. At least some successful tests of its individual components were given for successes, and no one ever saw a full-fledged flight of the rocket. What, then, was in those huge tubes on the transporters? Some kind of mystery item? The following year, the situation was completely unchanged, and this year, 2023, has been a real nightmare for the program. Dark Eagle has pretty much everything, and the Hyperion semi-trailer launcher. Pictured and specially designed M983A4 HEM transporter and AFADAC-70 mobile command post. It's just a matter of little to no rocket itself, without which it's all a bunch of expensive useless metal and plastic. Only officially the launch of the rocket was cancelled 4 times, although information about many failed attempts to the public simply ceased to be communicated. For example, about the failure of the test in October 2023, the newspapers only found out about it in the middle of this November. And only after that the Pentagon, represented by Douglas Ross Bush, head of the U.S. Army's Weapons Procurement Department, gave journalists the stunning news that the missile, which had already been accepted for service, would not be tested in the next 6 months. To quote, "Today, we are still doing root cause analysis. After you have a failed test, you take the thing back, take it apart, and team members work with engineers on exactly what the failure was. We are close to understanding exactly what the problem was, and this will help us get back to testing in 6 months." Incidentally, Lockheed Martin representatives later admitted that for the video in 2021 they were showing a mock-up container for a future rocket. Anyway, did you appreciate the elegance of this wonderful phrase? We're getting close, but we still haven't figured it out yet. In 6 months, we'll know for sure. Hello, Douglas. What have you adopted, then? Can I ask you a question? Yes, exactly the same phrases almost word for word were heard in 2021 and in 2022, and still there. However, all these questions are purely rhetorical. Do you remember the hysteria of the US government-controlled and supposedly independent military publications, proving that the Russian Dagger is not a hypersonic missile at all, and Russian Zircon is not even a cartoon? Then this crazy team quieted down under the pressure of objective circumstances. It came to life one more time in May this year, when a famous former boxer posed with a certain mysterious cornerman, passing it off as a downed Patriot warhead of the KH-47M2 Dagger aeroballistic system. Nowadays, on the same resources about the plight of America's own hypersonics there is just a sepulchral silence. I wonder how long it will last.